Last week we talked about a lament. This week I'd like to kind of continue in that same vein, but with one of the minor prophets. Habakkuk has often been paralleled as a lament, and in it Habakkuk asks this question: how can it be that you're allowing all this evil to take place? He looks around at the conditions in his society and he says, Lord, how can you allow this to keep going? And the Lord gives him a response that he's not too happy about. He says, I'm going to send Babylon as a judgment on my people in Judea. Well, Habakkuk doesn't like that either, because he says, well, Babylon is even worse than Judea. Babylon is more corrupt and even more evil than Israel itself. And God has an answer to that as well, and that is that he will ultimately bring down every evil empire, and that Israel in a way has become like Babylon, and therefore God is going to use Babylon to destroy her in order that God can redeem a righteous remnant. And he ends Habakkuk with this statement: though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vine, the produce of the oil fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And so at the end of Habakkuk, after Habakkuk has received the judgment, which maybe Habakkuk already knew from other prophets, that it would be Babylon who would crush the southern kingdom of Judah, that ultimately God would restore the fortunes of his people. He would lead a new exodus and would save his Messiah and his righteous people. And it may seem far removed from us today, but in a time when it's really hard to know what God is doing, in a time when it seems like there's chaos all around and very little talk of righteousness, very little talk of God, that we could despair as God's people. But God has given us an example in the person of Habakkuk, who saw injustice, who saw violence, and yet had an encounter with God that made him realize and trust this promise, that though evil may reign for a time, it will ultimately be overthrown. And we have the benefit of hindsight. Babylon, as much as it seemed impossible to the people of that day, Babylon fell. And so too will every kingdom and every power that stands against God. And even though we don't see it, even if it looks like we're surrounded by drought and despair, and that there is no evidence of God's providence at this time, we can rejoice in the Lord. He is our strength. We don't hope in circumstances. We hope in him. We hope in his character, and we hope in his future deliverance based on who he is. And so even in the midst of lament, even in the midst of times of sorrow and loss and confusion, we can trust in the Lord. Let him be our strength this day. Amen.